James Mercer had served 20 years in the military's most classified divisions before retiring to a quiet suburban neighborhood in Arizona. At 45, his weathered face and calm demeanor revealed little of his past as a black ops specialist who had conducted missions in 37 countries. The neighbors knew him only as the polite private homeowner who kept his modest ranch-style home and backyard pool immaculately maintained. What they didn't know was that James still maintained certain habits from his former life. Motion sensors around his property perimeter, high-resolution security cameras with facial recognition, and a morning ritual of swimming exactly 50 laps in his pool before dawn. His retirement had been hard-earned, paid for with nightmares and scars he never discussed. The backyard pool had been his one non-negotiable purchase, a place to find peace through the rhythm of swimming. Dawn had barely broken as James sliced through the cool water, his powerful strokes perfectly timed with his measured breathing. The neighborhood around him still slumbered, unaware of the former operative completing his daily regimen. Lap 47, 48, 49. With the precision of a Swiss timepiece, James touched the wall for his 50th lap and hoisted himself from the water in a single fluid motion. Water cascaded from his lean, muscular frame as he reached for his towel. The scars that mapped his body told stories he'd never share. The jagged line across his left shoulder from Kandahar, the small circular mark on his lower back from Bogota, the long surgical scar on his right thigh from an extraction gone wrong in Myanmar. Each was a chapter in a classified book, redacted from public knowledge. After toweling off, James walked the perimeter of his property as he did every morning, checking the integrity of his security measures. The routine was as much psychological as practical, old habits from a life where vigilance meant survival. His eyes scanned for anything out of place. A gate not fully latched, unfamiliar footprints in the soft earth by the fence line, disturbances in the careful arrangement of small pebbles he placed in strategic locations. Back inside, James brewed his coffee, Colombian, black, and opened his laptop. A notification showed 3 new neighbors had moved into the subdivision in the past month. He'd already run background checks on them, finding nothing concerning: a retired school teacher, a young couple who both worked in healthcare, and a middle manager who'd relocated from Minnesota. James wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. There was a difference. The walls of his home office were deliberately bare except for a single-framed photograph. 4 men in civilian clothes standing on a nondescript beach, arms around each other's shoulders, faces tanned and grinning. Only James remained alive from that group. He never displayed military memorabilia or awards. Those remained locked in a fireproof safe in his basement, along with 3 passports in different names and currencies from 12 countries. His phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez, a former colleague now working with local law enforcement. Their monthly check-in was brief and coded. "Still on for chess Thursday. Bringing that bottle we discussed." Translation: all clear on monitoring of potential threats, and the background intel on the new Homeowners Association president was being delivered. James replied with a thumbs-up emoji, the only one he ever used. He had no social media presence, limited his digital footprint to essentials, and paid for everything possible in cash. The neighbors thought him something of a technophobe or perhaps just old-fashioned. The truth was far more calculated. As the morning advanced, James settled into his home office chair and pulled up the real estate listings he'd been monitoring. His neighbors on the east side were planning to sell, and he intended to purchase their property through a shell company he'd established. Not out of any desire for expansion, but because their backyard offered a direct line of sight into his pool area, a security vulnerability he preferred to control rather than merely monitor. On a scorching Tuesday afternoon in July, James was reviewing security footage on his tablet when an alert pinged. Someone had opened his back gate. The camera feed showed a middle-aged woman in designer sunglasses leading 3 teenagers in swimwear into his backyard. James watched, bewildered, as the woman tested his pool water with her toe before instructing the teens to go ahead and jump in. James reviewed the facial recognition results. Catherine Westfield, 48, resident of the gated community 3 blocks over, where their own community pool was closed for renovations. She had never spoken to James, yet here she was, making herself at home in his private space while he watched from his home office window. The system automatically pulled up her public profile. Executive Vice President at a luxury real estate firm, married to Richard Westfield of Westfield Development Group, mother of 2, board member of 3 local charities. Her social media presence was curated to perfection: charity galas, vacation photos in exotic locations, and carefully staged family portraits in coordinating outfits. James noted that her husband was indeed on several HOA boards, though not his. James toddled between camera angles as the teens, 2 boys and a girl, roughly 16 to 18 years old, hesitated at the pool's edge. The oldest boy appeared to be Catherine's son based on facial similarity metrics. James didn't rush. He changed into casual clothes, slipped on his deck shoes, and walked outside with deliberate calm. The teens were splashing loudly while Catherine lounged on one of James' patio chairs, scrolling through her phone. "Excuse me," James said quietly, standing at the pool's edge. Catherine glanced up, annoyed at the interruption. "Oh, you must be the pool man. The deep end could use more chlorine." James smiled thinly. "I'm not the pool man. I'm the homeowner. This is private property." Catherine waved dismissively. "Don't be ridiculous. Everyone knows this is the neighborhood's overflow pool. We're from Sycamore Heights, and our pool is being resurfaced. Ma'am, this is my private residence. There is no overflow pool arrangement. I need you all to leave immediately." James maintained the precise distance of 7 feet from Catherine, close enough to establish authority, but far enough to avoid appearing threatening. His posture was neutral, weight evenly distributed between both feet, hands visible and open at his sides. These were tactical choices made instinctively after thousands of high-stress confrontations across the globe. Catherine's eyes narrowed behind her designer sunglasses as she assessed him. James recognized the calculation happening behind her gaze. She was determining whether he was someone she could intimidate or someone she needed to charm. Her initial dismissal suggested she concluded the former. "Look," she said, her tone shifting to one of condescension barely masked as patience. "I understand you're probably new to the area. My friend Stephanie Hargrove, she's the wife of Judge Hargrove, she told me specifically that during pool renovations, residents can use this facility. We're on the approved list." She gestured vaguely toward the water where the teenagers had paused their horseplay to watch the exchange. James didn't blink. "There is no approved list because this is not a facility. It's my backyard. I've lived here for 3 years, and I've never authorized anyone to use my pool." One of the teenagers, a girl with long blonde hair now plastered to her shoulders, frowned. "Mom, are you sure this is the right house? Didn't Steph say it was the blue one on Oak Ridge?" Catherine shot her daughter a silencing glare. "This is obviously the overflow pool, Madison. Look at how well it's maintained." "It's maintained," James replied evenly, "because it's my private property that I personally care for. I'll give you all 5 minutes to collect your belongings and exit the way you came in." The second boy, slightly younger than Catherine's son, had clambered out of the pool and was hastily gathering his towel. "Mrs. Westfield, I think we should go." "Nonsense, Ryan. Your mother is on the Sycamore Heights social committee with me, and she would be very disappointed to hear that we let ourselves be chased off from a community amenity." James noted the changing dynamic, the teenagers growing uncomfortable, while Catherine doubled down. It was a pattern he'd seen in hostage situations. When confronted with reality, some people became more entrenched in their alternate version of events. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," James said, his voice still calm but with a new edge of finality. "Allow me to clarify. This property at 1478 Mesa Drive is registered to James Mercer. That's me. It is zoned as single-family residential with no public access easements or community use designations. Your presence here constitutes criminal trespass under Arizona Statute 1315-02, which is a Class 1 misdemeanor." The legal precision of this statement finally pierced Catherine's armor of entitlement. She sat up straighter, removing her sunglasses to get a better look at him. "You're not a lawyer, are you?" "No, ma'am. But I am someone who values privacy and respects boundaries. Now you have a choice to make in the next 4 minutes. Leave voluntarily or explain to responding officers why you broke into a private residence." Catherine's son, Tommy, was now also exiting the pool, water streaming from his board shorts. "Mom," he muttered, "this is getting weird. Let's just go." But Catherine wasn't ready to concede. Her face flushed as she stood up, squaring her shoulders and stepping toward James with the confidence of someone unaccustomed to being refused. Catherine's face flushed red as she stood up, pointing a manicured finger at James. "Do you know who my husband is? He's on the Regional 800 board. We pay good money to use these facilities." James didn't raise his voice. "There are 3 security cameras recording this conversation. You've trespassed on private property, broken into my backyard, and are now refusing to leave when asked. I'm giving you one opportunity to collect your things and exit through the gate you unlawfully entered." "Are you threatening me?" Catherine shrieked loud enough that the teenagers stopped splashing to watch. "I'll call the police." "Please do," James replied, offering his phone. "Officer Rodriguez handles this district. I can provide her number." Something in his steady gaze made Catherine hesitate. It was the complete absence of anger or intimidation that unsettled her most, just the calm certainty of a man who had faced far worse than an entitled neighbor. The teenagers had now all exited the pool, clustering together uncertainly on the far side of the patio. Water dripped from their bodies onto James's carefully laid stonework as they exchanged nervous glances. The girl Madison was furiously texting someone, her fingers flying across her phone screen. "This is harassment," Catherine declared, her voice rising an octave as she reached for her designer handbag. "I'm documenting everything that's happening here. My husband's attorney will be in touch. James remained unmoved, his breathing steady and controlled. In Fallujah, he had once spent 14 hours in complete stillness, waiting for an extraction window while hostile forces searched within meters of his position. Catherine Westfield's indignation barely registered as a stressor in comparison. Your trespassing is already documented, he replied calmly. The gate entry at 2:34 p.m., your verbal claim about community access at 2:36 p.m., and your continued refusal to leave after being informed of your error at 2:38 p.m. Arizona law is quite clear about a homeowner's rights in these situations. Catherine pulled out her phone, fingers trembling slightly as she fumbled with the screen. I'm calling Richard right now. He knows the sheriff personally. The oldest boy, Tommy, approached his mother with visible embarrassment. Mom, seriously, let's just go. This is obviously his house. Not now, Tommy, she snapped, waving him away as she put the phone to her ear. Richard, you need to come to the overflow pool right now. Some man is harassing us and threatening to call the police. James watched her face closely, noting the subtle shifts in her expression as her husband presumably responded. Her eyebrows first drew together in confusion, then shot upward in disbelief and finally settled into a look of dawning comprehension. Behind her, the teenagers had begun gathering their belongings, clearly sensing the shifting tide. The younger boy, Ryan, was already heading toward the gate, towel wrapped around his shoulders and flip-flops slapping against his wet feet. But Stephanie specifically told May. Catherine protested into the phone, her voice now lower and defensive. Well, how was I supposed to know? It looks exactly like a community pool. James glanced at his watch, a simple, durable model that had accompanied him through 3 war zones. The confrontation had lasted precisely 7 minutes. In his experience, most civilian confrontations resolved within 10 minutes once the balance of power became clear to all parties. Catherine's phone call continued, her free hand now pressed against her forehead in what appeared to be genuine distress. You can't be serious. That neighborhood, but he seems so ordinary. James recognized the moment her perception shifted. It was visible in the sudden rigidity of her posture, the way her eyes darted to reassess him, no longer as an obstacle to her afternoon plans, but as something potentially more significant. He had seen that same recalibration countless times across negotiating tables and in hostage situations, the moment when an adversary realizes they have critically misread both the situation and the person standing before them. Mom, I think we should go, one of the teenagers said nervously, climbing out of the pool. Not until this man apologizes for his rudeness, Catherine insisted, pulling out her own phone. I'm calling Richard to straighten this out. James simply waited, hands relaxed at his sides. When Catherine's husband answered, she launched into a tirade about the aggressive man threatening them at the community overflow pool. The color drained from Catherine's face as her husband spoke. The teenagers watched as she stammered. What do you mean it's not community property? The woman at the salon said. After a long pause, she whispered, he's that guy. The one, whoa. She glanced at James with new eyes, suddenly seeing the precise, economical way he held himself. The scars on his forearms, the way he had positioned himself between her and the exit without seeming to move. Yes, I understand, she said into the phone, her voice now hushed and compliant. We're leaving immediately. As she lowered the phone, her hand was visibly trembling. The transformation in her demeanor was immediate and complete, from righteous indignation to something approaching reverence mixed with fear. She fumbled with her belongings, dropping her sunglasses and fumbling to retrieve them. We've made a terrible mistake, she announced to the teenagers, her voice strained with forced brightness. This is, in fact, Mr. Mercer's private residence. Tommy, help Madison collect her things. Ryan, make sure we haven't left anything in the pool. James observed the shift with clinical detachment. He'd seen it before, the moment when perception aligns with reality and a person's entire worldview undergoes an instantaneous recalibration. In his line of work, such moments were often accompanied by the realization that one had nearly died without knowing it. Tommy, still confused by his mother's sudden change, approached James with uncertain steps. Sir, I'm really sorry about this. We didn't know. James acknowledged the apology with a slight nod. Your mother received incorrect information. Mistakes happen. Catherine overheard and hurried over, placing herself between James and her son as if she suddenly perceived a threat that hadn't concerned her minutes earlier. Yes, a complete misunderstanding. Stephanie Hargrove told me this was community property, but obviously she was misinformed. Her eyes darted to his arms, lingering on the jagged scar that ran from his elbow to wrist, a souvenir from an extraction in Beirut that had gone sideways. She seemed to be cataloging details now, connecting the physical evidence before her with whatever information her husband had shared. Richard says you've lived here for 3 years, she continued, her words tumbling out nervously. We should have properly introduced ourselves when you moved in. The neighborhood association usually organizes a welcome reception, but somehow we must have overlooked. Her voice trailed off as she noticed for the first time the small, nearly invisible camera mounted on the umbrella stand. Then her eyes tracked to another by the pool filter and a third disguised as a decorative element on the fence. The realization that every moment of their trespass had been recorded in high definition seemed to hit her anew. The security is impressive, she managed, her social veneer cracking further. James remained professionally neutral. Simple precautions, nothing excessive. Madison had finished gathering her things and stood awkwardly by the gate, clearly eager to escape. Ryan was already outside, visible through the slats of the fence as he paced nervously on the sidewalk. Only Tommy seemed genuinely curious rather than frightened, studying James with undisguised interest. "Did you really work in?" the boy began, but Catherine cut him off with a sharp "Tommy" that left no room for argument. "My husband would very much like to speak with you personally," Catherine said, composing herself with visible effort. "To apologize properly for this intrusion. Perhaps you could join us for dinner sometime." "We're leaving right now," she said into the phone before hanging up. "My apologies for the misunderstanding," Catherine said stiffly, gathering her things. "Children, get your towels." James said nothing, merely stepping aside to clear their path to the gate. As they hurried past, the youngest teenager whispered, "Sorry, sir," while the oldest asked, "Were you really in Black Ops?" "Tommy," Catherine hissed, yanking his arm. James just held the gate open. "Next time, ask before entering someone's property. It's not just about courtesy. It could be about safety." Catherine couldn't meet his eyes as she hustled the teenagers through the gate. As James closed it behind them, he heard her urgently whispering to the group, "Richard says he worked with SEAL Team 6 before going classified. He said half the neighborhood board was against approving his home purchase because of security concerns." From his vantage point by the gate, James watched them retreat down the sidewalk. Catherine's posture had completely transformed. Gone was the entitled swagger, replaced by hunched shoulders and quick, nervous steps. She glanced back twice, as if concerned he might be following them. The teenagers clustered around her, their wet hair still dripping onto their shoulders as they peppered her with questions that James could no longer hear. Tommy, the oldest boy, kept turning to look back with undisguised curiosity rather than fear. James waited until they had rounded the corner before returning to his patio. He methodically restored each piece of furniture to its proper position, wiped down the wet surfaces, and checked the water quality of his pool. Their brief intrusion had left multiple signs: a forgotten hair tie on the deck, condensation rings from their drinks on his table, and footprints still drying on the stonework. As he cleaned, James accessed the camera feed through his phone, reviewing the entire interaction from multiple angles. He saved the relevant footage to a secure drive, not out of paranoia, but from the habitual documentation that had kept him alive for 2 decades in the field. Information was always an asset, especially when dealing with civilians who might later revise their recollection of events. His phone buzzed with a text from Officer Rodriguez, "Need backup." James replied with a simple "all clear" and returned to his cleanup. Inside, James made himself a cup of tea, Earl Grey, hot, and sat at his kitchen counter. The silence of his home settled around him again, the disruption contained and neutralized. Yet something lingered in the aftermath, a ripple in the carefully controlled isolation he had constructed. His phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. The sender was Richard Westfield. The subject line read simply, "My wife's trespass. My apologies." James opened it, scanning the carefully worded message. Richard explained that his wife had indeed been misinformed by a neighbor about a community overflow pool, apologized profusely for the intrusion, and mentioned his awareness of James' background without specific details. The email concluded with an invitation to dinner and a request that James consider the matter resolved without involving authorities. Attached was a photograph of Richard's business card, CDO of Westfield Development, with phone numbers and an address in the upscale Sycamore Heights community. A power move disguised as courtesy. Richard was establishing his own credentials while acknowledging James's. James closed the email without responding. Experience had taught him that immediate responses often revealed more than they resolved. He would wait 24 hours before deciding how to proceed, a cooling-off period that allowed for clearer assessment of potential outcomes. Through his front window, James noticed a black SUV moving slowly down the street, Richard Westfield doing reconnaissance, no doubt coming to assess the situation himself after his wife's dramatic phone call. The vehicle paused briefly in front of James' house before continuing on. James sipped his tea, unmoved. The Westfields' world had collided with his today, and they were still recalibrating to this new reality. He had seen it countless times before, civilians discovering that their ordered suburban existence occasionally intersected with the shadows that men like him inhabited. The next morning, James found a gift basket at his front door with a formal written apology. Catherine had apparently learned not just his identity but the story of how he'd once rescued 3 American hostages from a compound in a country that officially had no U.S. military presence. The basket contained expensive wine, gourmet snacks, and pool cleaning supplies. James donated the basket to the local Veterans Center and installed a new higher gate with a digital lock. He never spoke directly to Catherine again, though he would occasionally see her at the grocery store, where she would quickly turn down another aisle to avoid him. The teens, however, showed up 3 weeks later with their father, Catherine's husband Richard, who formally introduced himself and apologized. He explained that his son Tommy wanted to join the military after high school and asked if James might be willing to give the boys some advice. James invited them in for lemonade by the pool, the proper way to visit, and found himself sharing sanitized stories of his service, while the teenager listened with rapt attention. It wasn't the retirement he had planned, becoming an informal mentor to a neighborhood kid, but it was more satisfying than the solitude he had resigned himself to. And to this day, no one ever again entered his backyard without an explicit invitation. The Veterans Center called to thank him for the donation, making a point to mention how much the families they served appreciated the high-quality items. James was not listed as the donor, but Officer Rodriguez volunteered there on weekends and had connected the dots. "You could have kept that Bordeaux for yourself," she texted him. "It retails for $200. James had replied simply, "Others need it more." The exchange reminded him of field operations where resources found during missions were often redistributed to local allies rather than kept or destroyed. Tommy Westfield began stopping by once a week, initially with his father, later alone. Their conversations evolved from naive questions about combat to more substantive discussions about service, duty, and the realities of military life. James found himself oddly invested in correcting the boy's Hollywood-influenced misconceptions, steering him toward a more grounded understanding of what it meant to serve. "My mom still talks about that day sometimes," Tommy admitted during one visit, looking embarrassed. "She tells her friends she had a momentary lapse of judgment and calls it a learning experience." James nodded, unsurprised. Most people go their whole lives without having their assumptions directly challenged. It can be illuminating. "She made me promise never to drop by unannounced," Tommy added with a grin. "She's convinced you have the place booby-trapped." James didn't confirm or deny this, merely offering the boy another glass of lemonade. Richard Westfield proved surprisingly genuine in his own way. As CDO of a development company, he had connections throughout the region and quietly ensured that James' privacy was respected within the community. When an Overeager real estate blog attempted to publish a feature on the secret operator among us, the article mysteriously never made it past the draft stage. James maintained his routines, swimming at dawn, perimeter checks, monitoring local activities. But something had shifted. The Westfield incident had cracked open a door he kept firmly shut since retirement. He began accepting occasional dinner invitations from Rodriguez and her husband. He volunteered one morning a month at the Veterans Center, teaching self-defense to veterans with PTSD, finding unexpected common ground in their shared hypervigilance. His home remained his sanctuary, his security measures still in place, but the walls he built around his life had developed small, deliberate openings, controlled points of access that allowed for connection without compromising his safety. 6 months after the trespassing incident, Catherine Westfield's charity gala needed emergency security when their hired team canceled at the last minute. Richard called James not to ask him to provide security, but for a recommendation. James connected him with former colleagues who ran a discreet private firm. The event went flawlessly, and Catherine sent another basket, this time addressed to both James and the Veterans Center. The neighborhood that had once viewed him with suspicion now regarded him with a curious respect. No one trespassed on his property, but the isolation he had expected to define his retirement had been subtly transformed into something more nuanced, a carefully calibrated engagement with the world on his own terms.